Hilton too. Good morning. Nice to
Morning.
see you.
Morning. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning, Ronnie.
Morning.
Good morning,
Morning.
Ronnie.
Mm.
Okay. Mark, are you going to let us see you? Maybe. Okay. All right. So I guess we'll start. And what time is it? 10:33.
It's recording. So.
Recording. Okay, good. So good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Nice to see you on this not so beautiful day, but it's supposed to get nicer. I'm glad we'll all be able to study the third of our series on wisdom literature. And as I have for the past two classes, we're continuing to dedicate our learning in the memory of our beloved friend, Joan Hulkauer, Hannah Ruth. Oh, okay, is that me? I don't think that's me. Hannah Ruth, and so today's our second to last session. And next week, when we study the book of Ruth, and since her name was Hannah Ruth, we will for sure be channeling her beautiful neshama to study. So, if you can, everyone, just for a minute, unmute, and they have the ability to unmute, right, Kathy? So just so we can say our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Torah.
Blessed are you, our Lord, our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with your commandments and given us the mitzvah to study and engage with Torah. So the arc of our class this morning is that we'll do an introduction to the book of Job and see how it fits into wisdom literature. And we'll read the opening 3 chapters, and then we'll look at some of the ideas in Job. And then we're going to take a look at the final chapters, especially the last chapter. And then we'll talk about the lessons of the book of Job. I'm sure you'll have things that you'll want to say along the way. Feel free to unmute yourselves and just call out. And we're going to start with my screen share. I don't have my ability to screen share yet, Kathy. Am I a co-host? Let's try this again. No, it's your screen share. Whoops. Screen share. Okay, there we go. All right. Everyone can see that? Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start off with a reading by Solomon Schimmel, this beautiful book that I found, an old book, Wounds Not Healed by Time. It's one of these out-of-print books that I found that it's all about forgiveness. So I was wondering if we could get someone to unmute and read this for us, please. Any volunteer?
Here we go.
Thank you.
Repentance and forgiveness. As far as religious belief in God is concerned, it seems to me in the camps there were 2 kinds of believing Jews.
Oh, excuse me. I forgot to say just that this is a recollection of a Holocaust survivor who was not only in the camps, but he was forced to work in the gas chambers, hosing down the corpses after they were murdered. That was important for context.
And when was this published?
When was the book? I don't know. I forgot that. I don't know when he gave the interview. The book was published, I don't know, years ago. It's an old book.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, as far as religious belief in God is concerned, it seems to me that in the camps there were 2 kinds of believing Jews, 2 contradictory responses to God for the horror of life in the camp. Either complete submission to God, capitulation to God's enormous, incomprehensible, inscrutable will, or blaspheming him, cursing him, not really denying him, but detesting him, despising him, menacing him, threatening to withhold faith in him. God, if you don't do something, I'm going to stop believing in you. You've got to be very close to God. You have to know him very well to blaspheme him. Only a deeply religious person can despise God, shake his fist at God, and abuse him. A blaspheming Jew is a believing Jew, and the camps were composed of these Jews in great numbers. There were the Jews who always tried to keep their heads covered when they ate, even if they only had the palm of their hand to serve as a skull cap, and they never took a gulp or bite of food with mumbling a prayer. They never took a gulp or bite without, I would say, mumbling a prayer over the bread, regardless of how hungry they were. Moments earlier, these same Jews were threatening God with denying his existence. Can you put it up?
Oh, sorry, just as one more line.
Oh, being an atheist in the camp was no easy thing.
There's no easy thing. Thank you, Susan. I love the way you read it. You know, you could really feel the pathos that there's trying to bring out in this. So this is, excuse me, this is where the journey of the book of Job leads us. Excuse me, not to the concentration camps, but to that place of what happens when we feel that our faith is being tested beyond what we can bear. How do we still believe in God when things are horrible? The author of Job, and biblical scholars don't know who the author is, most likely there was more than one, is obsessed with God. The author never wonders or speculates about God's existence, but does express his outrage at the spectacular injustice of a world that is supposedly governed by a just God. So the book of Job is a most unusual and somewhat mysterious book. It starts with 2 chapters of narrative, which describe a wager between Satan and God. And God is telling Satan what a wonderful servant Job is. I have this wonderful servant Job. And Satan says, well, that's because he has everything. He's got everything a person could want. He's wealthy. He's got 10 beautiful children, 7 daughters and 7 sons and 3 daughters. He has power, prestige, privilege. So let's see if Job could be such a tzaddik, such a righteous person, if he didn't have all the trappings of this wonderful life. So God tells Satan, well, Job, his lot is in your hands. Do whatever you want with him, but make sure you don't kill him. So by the end of the first 2 chapters, Job has suffered many terrible losses, including the death of all 10 of his children and his health, but he nevertheless remains patient. He's refusing to speak against God. The tone of the work abruptly changes, however, in chapter 3, when the book shifts from narrative to poetry. After losing everything and everyone, Job really wants to die. The book is powerful because Job suffers so much that he wants to die in order to alleviate the suffering. The God who makes Job suffer won't let him die. And many people think that the traditional question at the center of Job is, why do good things or bad things happen to good people? But according to my professor my Bible professor at JTS, Rabbi Amy Kalmanovsky, the central question is even more challenging, is that why does God keep those who suffer alive? Why doesn't he let them die, especially if they want to? In the book of Job, the prose of the first 2 chapters and the last chapter, so Job has 42 chapters. The first 2 are prose and the last one is prose. And the 39 other chapters are written in poetry. And so it's like they've got this bookend, prose and then poetry and then prose. And after Job loses everything, he encounters 3 friends who first sit with him while he's sitting Shiva and then proceed to ask him, why does he think that all these catastrophes have befallen him? But not only are the styles different between the prose and the poetry, we have a different theology as well. It's as if there's 2 Jobs and 2 very different ideas about God. Job is described as patient, but he's only patient in the prologue, and he's far from patient in the poetry. We're going to take a look at some of that right now. Okay. We're going to read the first couple of chapters of Job in the English because it's really quite powerful. So we're only going to read the English, and I am going to interrupt a couple of times when someone is reading. So I need 1 volunteer to read chapter 1 and 1 volunteer to read chapter 2, please.
I'll read.
Thank you. Only the English, obviously.
There was a man in the land of Uz named Job. The man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil.
It's even the way the book starts off. It says there was a man in the land of Uz. It's almost starts off like a fairy tale, right? It's like this is a story, right? There once was an old woman who lived in a shoe. There once was a man who lived in the land of in Uz. Okay, continue, please. I'm sorry.
7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very large household. The man was wealthier than anyone in the East. It was the custom of his sons to hold feasts, each on his set day in his own home. They would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a round of feasts was over, Job would send word to them to sanctify themselves, and rising early in the morning, he would make burnt offerings, one for each of them. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned and blasphemed God in their thoughts. This is what Job always used to do. One day, the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord, and the adversary came along with them.
The adversary is also called Satan in Hebrew. Yeah.
The Lord said to the adversary, have you noticed my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. The adversary answered the Lord, does Job not have good reason to fear God? Why, it is you who have fenced him around him and his household and all that he has. You have blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out in the land.
We're on 11.
Okay. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face. The Lord replied to the adversary, see, all that he has is in your power, and do not lay a hand on him. The adversary departed from the presence of the Lord. One day, as his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the she-asses were grazing alongside him, when the Sabaeans attacked them and carried them off and put the boys to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you.
Right. So that's in that. So we're coming up to verse 16. So first he loses all of the oxen. Okay.
This one was still speaking when another one came and said, God's fire fell from the heaven and took hold of the sheep and the boys and burned them up. I alone have escaped to tell you. This one was still speaking when another came and said, a Chaldean formation of 3 columns made a raid on the camels and carried them off and put the boys to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. This one was still speaking when another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, when suddenly a mighty wind came up from the wilderness. It struck the 4 corners of the house, and so it collapsed upon the young people, and they died.
Okay, so first he loses his cattle, his property, and then he loses his children.
I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose, tore his robe, cut off his hair, and threw himself on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. For all that, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach on God.
Right. So this is the first, we're just learning about just setting the stage for how Job had everything, and then everything was taken away. Okay. And then the second chapter actually starts out almost the same, with the God making a talking to the divine beings. That says, in one day the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord, like a continuation of the narrative. And we're going to go down to let's see. Verse 7. Someone else want to read this? Or Irene, continue?
Does someone else want to read?
Yeah. Does someone else want to read? If not, Irene, you can continue verse 7.
I can read.
Okay.
I can
Okay.
read. Okay. The adversary departed from the presence of the Lord and inflicted a severe inflammation on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He took a potsherd to scratch himself as he sat in ashes.
Right. So it wasn't enough that God took everything. That Satan took everything. Let's now give him boils from head to toe.
His wife said to him, "You still keep your integrity. Blaspheme God and die."
Right. We're not sure here. First of all, this is the only time that the wife is mentioned, mentioned one other time, and we're not exactly sure who the wife is. The Torah doesn't tell us anything about the wife. There are a lot of midrashim about who the wife is. Some midrashim say that she was a local woman also from Uz, also non-Jewish, because Job is not Jewish. He's from the land of Uz. And some scholars say that it's actually Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. Which would put Job at an interesting time frame. But the idea is that we're not sure if that she really wants him to be able to blaspheme God, or she just can't bear what's going on anymore either, and she actually wants him to die. So she's saying, blaspheme God, and then you'll die.
But he said to her, "You talk as any shameless woman might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil?" For all that, Job said nothing sinful. When Job's 3 friends heard about all these calamities that had befallen him, each came from his home: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Namathite. They met together to go and console and comfort him.
So he's got these 3 friends who are very sympathetic to what's going on, to what's going on with him. And these friends also, they share they also believe in God, but they're also not Jewish. So these are so far all the characters in this book are not Jewish.
Oh. When they saw him from a distance, they could not recognize him, and they broke into loud weeping. Each one tore his robe and threw dust into the air onto his head. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. None spoke a word to him, for they saw how very great was his suffering.
Right. So we have these friends. They're totally, like I said, they're sympathetic, they're empathic, they're sitting with him. And then in chapter 3, everything changes. Job's whole tone changes, right? Afterwards, Job began to speak and cursed the day of his birth. And Job spoke up and said, "Perish the day on which I was born, and the night it was announced that a male has been conceived." He doesn't want to not just forget about the day I was born, forget about the night that I was conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above have no concern for it. May light not shine on it. He's going to go a lot about darkness here. May darkness and deep gloom proclaim it. May a pall lie over the day that I was born. May what blackens the day terrify it. May obscurity carry off that night. May it not be counted among the days of the year. May it not appear in any of its months. May that night be desolate. May no sound of joy be heard in it. May those who cast spells on the day damn it, and those prepared to disable the Leviathan. May its twilight stars remain dark. May it hope for light and have none. May it not see the glimmerings of the divine. Why did I not die at birth, expire as I came forth from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me, that's his mother, on the birthing stool, or breasts for me to suck? For now I would be lying in repose, asleep and at rest, with the world's kings and councils who rebuild ruins for themselves, or with the nobles who possess gold and fill their houses with silver. Why was I not like a buried stillbirth, like the babies who never saw the light? There the wicked cease from troubling. There rest those whose strength is spent. Prisoners are wholly at ease. So he just wants to die. Why does God give light to the sufferer and life to the bitter in spirit? This is Job's big complaint. Why am I still alive? Why won't you let me die? To those who wait for death, but it does not come, who search for it more than treasure, who rejoice in its exaltation and are glad to reach the grave. For what I feared has overtaken me. What I dreaded has come upon me. I had no repose, no quiet, no rest, and trouble came.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
All these people are not Jewish. Were they all monotheists?
Yes, that's what they had in common with Job, that they were not Jewish, but they all believed in God, which is
Different.
Right, which is different thing. So, so it feels almost like there's two different personalities, right? We've got the personality of Job, the accepting Job in the first two chapters, which are prose, and then we have the God in the Job in chapter 3 who's shaking his fist at God. You know, I don't want this. I was born naked. I will die naked. That was the patient Job. Versus in 3, Job opens his mouth. The first thing he says is he wants to curse God and curse the day that he was born. We never see the submissive, patient Job in the poetry. We only see that Job in the prose part of the book.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Who's that? Sandy. Yeah.
This could these two sections, could they have been written by different people?
Yeah, that's what the scholars think. We don't really know.
It sounds like they're two different people, two different styles of writing, and Job's attitude is totally different.
And two different theologies. Exactly right. So we have the friends with similar perspectives, right? And then we have Job himself, who gives us a difficult message in this book, right? I wish I was, I don't want to live through this. And then at the end, we'll see we have God who offers a different kind of a message. So one of the central questions in the book of Job is, why does God make the suffering continue? Right? So we get 3 different answers in the book. From the friends, they tell us that the sufferers are kept alive because they deserve it. If you have suffering, it's because you did something that you deserve. You committed some sin. There are no innocent sufferings. And this is what in wisdom literature, the idea is if you live a good life, right, you're going to have a good life. So if you've done something wrong, you're going to be punished. But the second answer to this question is of why doesn't God end the suffering comes from Job. The suffering is kept alive because we're not supposed to know. We're not supposed to know the reasons. God knows the reasons. And Job offers us another idea is that if God is merciful, right? If God is merciful and I'm suffering, why doesn't God end my suffering or at least end my life? Job is actually saying that this is a cruelty on God's part, that to keep people alive who are suffering, God is suggesting, or the author of Job is suggesting that there's a cruelty there. In Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, which is also part of wisdom literature, the most radical message is that we're better off dead. And the radical message in Job is that God is cruel and doesn't let the sufferer die. So we see here that in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, the response to challenge and suffering is uvacharta v'chayim, therefore choose life. But in Job and Kohelet, the response is not I choose life, the response is I choose death. So in the Torah, the suffering happens to the sinners, and in Job, the suffering happens to the pious and the pure. And there are different psychological responses to this kind of anger at God. One is you change your perception, right? The first, you may have thought of God as a personal God who is there for you, and you change your mind. You say, nope, this is the God of an impersonal God, a God who's way up there. And if you don't expect God to intervene, then you won't be disappointed. Another possible response is that we see God as benevolent and compassionate, right? God is not in control of the evil. This is Harold Kushner, who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, that there's some other force out there, not God, that is in charge of the evil. Or some angry and disappointed believers can actually become either an agnostic or an atheist. Or an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God at all. And the agnostic is someone who believes that God created the world and then sort of left it on its own. So another way to look at the book of Job, which I wanted to share a teaching that I learned last summer from my teacher, Dr. Micah Goodman at the Hartman Institute, is that Job is an integral part of the Jewish canon because it's a critique of the Bible. And just bear with me, we'll get there. So there are 3 dialogues, right? There's the first 2 chapters are a dialogue between God and Satan. And then the next 36 chapters are a dialogue between Job and his friends. And at the end, we have dialogue between Job and God. And as we discussed in our first 2 classes, in the Torah, ritual is what protects you. You keep the laws and you'll be safe. In the prophets, ethics are what protects you. You take care of the orphan, you take care of the widow, feed the hungry, clothe the poor, and you're going to get long life. But in Job, nothing protects you. You can do everything right, and all these bad things can happen to you. So in the Torah, right, obey God's will and everything will be fine. And then come the prophets, especially Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah, who say that you can keep all the laws, you can keep all the ritual, but don't forget about the ethics. It's really the ethics that's the most important thing. If you protect the widows, the orphans, the minorities, immigrants, if we protect the unprotected, then we'll be protected. The idea of the prophets is not so much to look up to God, but to look down to the weaker people in society and to take care of them.
Yeah,
Yes, someone asked something?
it's Annette. I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. But the Torah also has multi-generational punishment for evil, for people perceived as evil, and you don't know whether they're children and their children's children. I mean, in one part it's to the 10th generation, and another part it's to a different generation.
Right.
So and their children and their children's children could very well be good people.
Right.
So how do we deal with that?
Well, that you're asking, like, how would Job deal with that?
I'm just saying that there is that sense of that there could be good people punished, even in
even in the Bible. You're saying even in the Torah. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, well, the idea in Job is that we don't understand. We don't understand where it comes from. Job does all the right things, and then he's punished, right? So Job challenges the whole system. So who is Job actually? So the very first words of the book say that he came from the land of Uz, from the land of Esau, and he's not Jewish. And it's interesting that we have this whole book about Job, who's not Jewish, in our canon. Yes, Sandy.
Along with what Annette said, could be another explanation. I guess that wouldn't be Jewish. It would be the Hindu explanation. But there is the idea of Gilgal, so maybe it could be part of it. The idea of karma and previous lives and being punished for another life you lived in. And I also had an additional question. If you're so unhappy with life, it's interesting, suicide is never even contemplated.
Never even mentioned. Never mentioned. Right.
I wondered about that.
Right. Never mentioned in Job. You would think that would be that might be something that's offered, but that I think according to Job that would just have been the easy way out. Job is destined to push through this. That's part of what we learn in the book of Job, that he's destined to try to figure this out. So Job at the very beginning is also he's called an Ish Tam, a morally perfect and righteous person. And it's interesting because, again, he's not Jewish. There's no Jewish personality in the Bible who's considered an Ish Tam. We have Noah, who's Ish Tam B'doro. He's a righteous man in his time, but there's no one about whom the Torah says he was an Ish Tam. He was a perfectly righteous person, except for Job. Okay. Job has 10 children before all the calamities, 7,000 cattle and 3,000 other animals and 500 oxen, I think. And his number is always rounded up to a full number. Like this is indicative of his perfect, round, full life that he had. This is the portrait that we get of Job. And then the camera shifts to behind the scenes, the conversation between God and Satan, right? All the B'nai Elohim, all the angels, all the celestial beings are hanging around with God, and God and Satan is the one who sort of provokes God and saying, well, I hear that you think that Job is so great, but that's he has a perfect life. He's the Ish Tam. Nothing has ever fazed him, so of course he's going to believe in you. So it's interesting because the book talks about the conflict of human nature. Like, are we naturally good? Are we naturally inclined to believe in God, or are we not? That's sort of one of the points of the book, a book of Job. And Micah Goodman says that it's not whether humans believe in God. The real question is whether God believes in the humans. So God actually does believe in Job. It's Satan who doesn't believe in the goodness of man. So how do God and Satan settle this argument? So Satan says, well, let's destroy not won't kill him, but let's destroy his life. And God says, okay. And in the Talmud, and Baba Batra, Rabbi Yochanan says that God, the Talmud actually talks about this, that God is enticed by Satan. God makes this deal with Satan. And if this wasn't actually written in the Torah, we'd never even be able to speak these words. We'd never be able to imagine that God could be enticed by Satan into a deal to prove somebody's goodness. That's a whole sugya, whole chapter about this in the Talmud. So Job loses everything, loses everyone, loses his health, but he still remains good. So and God still believes in Job's humanity. So the idea is we're supposed to believe in God, in our humanity. But Michael Goodman asks a good question. He says, well, okay, Job is good, but what about God? Is God good? What kind of God would kill Job's 10 children just to prove a point to all people, to Satan, right? So the question is not so much about humans, the question is about God. The book of Job moves us from an anthropological question, a question about what's the nature of man, to a theological one, which is what's the nature of God. The whole middle section where Job is involved with his in dialogue with his three friends is really, we're not going to read, I mean, can't read the whole thing. I wish we could, but you should read it because it's really very interesting. They all say, you must have done something wrong. And he says, I didn't do anything wrong. And it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Three different friends, chapters, back and forth and back and forth. They are trying to get Job to admit that his suffering is because it's something that he did. And Job doesn't buy it. And the end, which we'll read the end chapter, God comes to Job in a whirlwind and starts and to try to explain to Job what's going on. So God asks, well, who has strong opinions but has no knowledge? That's what God asks Job. It's like too many people today. They have a lot of opinions, but no knowledge. If you look at, I try not to look at Facebook too much. If you look at the postings on Facebook and on Instagram and all the other places, people are sharing their opinions without having any knowledge. There's a great Abraham Lincoln quote that said, "It's better to remain quiet and be thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt." Okay, so there's no need to have to, every time you get a thought, I mean, I see that on the social media, not that I'm not active on social media, but I do look at it from time to time just to see what people are up to. But people have all kinds of things to say and they don't know what they're talking about. So that's what God tells Job. You think you think you know what's going on, Job, but you have no idea. Where were you, God says, when I created the world? Do you have any wisdom about when I built the cosmos from nothing? Why do you think you have the right to ask questions about cosmic justice when you don't have a cosmic perspective, right? So Job is very angry with God and asking God for all kinds of answers about things that God is saying you just don't understand. And sometimes that's a very frustrating place to be in, right? If somebody says to you, well, you just don't understand, we want to be helped to understand. We want to know what's going on. God has the big picture, but we never have the whole picture. So there's this great analogy that I read about a scene in an operating room, right? If you didn't know what an operating room was and you just saw a bunch of people standing around a table cutting up a person, you would think, oh, this is a bad thing. But then you step back a little and you see, oh, they're doctors and they're trying to heal the person. So you think that that's a good thing. And then maybe you stand a little bit further back and then you see that these look like evil doctors, right? Because they're doing an experiment on this person and that's a bad thing. But then you stand further back even more and you say, oh, they're doing research. What they're doing, the experiment they're doing on this person will maybe cure millions of other people. So it's all about the perspective, right? We don't have the perspective to judge, right? We don't have this perspective to judge God, and we don't have the perspective to judge other people. So God's argument is the classic answer that we can't question God's ethics. We can only challenge our judgment of these ethics, because there's always a huge cognitive gap between cosmic judgment and what we're really able to know. Barbara, I see you're smiling. I'm not sure what that means. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Now, I wanted to go in a completely different direction, so if you have time, we'll talk about it.
Okay, okay. So in the end, in chapter 40, okay, God asks Job. So God is talking to Job from the whirlwind, telling him, you have no clue what's going on. I created everything. You don't know what it's like. I created all the animals. And he goes on and on for a couple of chapters. I created all the animals. I created all the trees. I created everything. And so God says to Job, God's waiting for a response from Job, and Job folds. Job says, I'm a lightweight. I have no more questions. I can't, I have to accept your answer. I don't know why this happened to me. You're saying that I can't know why it happens to me because you're God and only you know. And so Job accepts the answer. The question is, can we accept God's answer? Okay. God persuades the hero, but does God persuade us as the readers? Okay, as modern readers of Job, it's hard for us to buy into this idea that we'll never know why God made Job have all this suffering. But the truth is, we do know. If we read the book of Job, and we just did, we read the first 2 chapters, we know why Job is suffering. He's suffering because God made a deal with Satan. So this is in a literal sense, this is irony. We know something about the protagonist. The protagonist never gets to know this, doesn't know that God and Satan made a deal, and that about, you know, how perfect would he be if we take away all his wonderful life. But that's what's going on here. We know the real story. So I think it's interesting because so what do we do with that dichotomy, right? That Job says, I don't know why I'm suffering. And God says, well, you're suffering because there's no reason for the suffering, but we know that there really is a reason. So the book of Job was written between the 5th and 6th centuries BCE. And the Talmud in Baba Batra, the same Talmud that we quoted before, asks, who is Job? Some people think that Job is Abraham. Some scholars, some think that Job is Moses. And some rabbis in the Talmud say that Job never really existed at all. It's a parable. This is also Rambam's opinion. In the Guide to the Perplexed, says the story of Job never happened. It never happened, yet it's a true story, because it's not about Job, it's really about us. And the truth in the Job is eternal. It's not something that happened, it is something that happens to us now and again, to people we know, people we love. The world is not what was promised to us, right? The Job is about a mature relationship between God and humans. And if we understand that what's not promised to us, what was promised to us may not happen. We don't, you know, so the real question is, what is this book doing in the Tanakh? Just take a look for a second at the last chapter. Share screen, source sheet. Okay, chapter 38 is when God starts speaking to Job out of the tempest and you know, says, you don't know anything. You don't know anything about building the world. I created the world. You can't know any of this. I sometimes find that difficult also when someone says, you can't possibly know what I'm going through. It's true, you can't know what someone is going through, but I don't know, sometimes try to explain it. I think sometimes that would be more helpful. Chapter 42. So in chapter 42, right? Someone want to read the chapter 42, just the English? This is the very last chapter of Job.
I'll do it.
Thank you.
Job said in reply to the Lord, I know that you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible for you. Who is this who obscures counsel without knowledge? Indeed, I spoke without understanding of things beyond me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask, and you will inform me. I had heard you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. Therefore, I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes.
Okay, so just want to say that at this point, this chapter, we're leaving the poetry and we're going back to the prose. The very end is prose.
After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am incensed at you and your two friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. And let Job, my servant, pray for you. For to him I will show favor and not treat you vilely, since you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Gotta move it up there. Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord had told them, and the Lord showed favor to Job. The Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed on behalf of his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice what he had before. All his brothers and sisters and all his former friends came to him and had a meal with him in his house. They consoled and comforted him for the misfortune that the Lord had brought upon him. Each gave him 1 kesita and each 1 gold ring. Thus the Lord blessed the latter years of Job more than the former. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 she-asses. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first he named Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Keren Hapuch. Now, nowhere in the land were women as beautiful as Job's daughters to be found. Their father gave them estates together with their brothers. Afterwards, Job lived 140 years to see 4 generations of sons and grandsons. So Job died old and contented.
Okay. So this idea, first of all, that, that God restores everything back to Job, and they gave him 10 more kids. God forbid, I've never lost a child, and God forbid anybody should lose a child. But no matter how many more kids you have, it doesn't bring back the kids that you lost from before. So we desperately want to believe that if we live a good life, all will go well for us. And then we read the book of Job, and we see it as the critique of that theology. And so this is also Micah's interesting point, Micah Goodman's point. He says, maybe Job is not in the Bible only to critique it, but maybe Job being in the Bible is important because it's integral to the Bible. Job presents us with something called biblical pluralism. The Bible allows its total opposite theology to be part of the Bible. Right? The Bible models radical listening for us by allowing an opposing critical view to be part of the Bible. And radical listening is a very Hartman idea, to really be able to understand what the other person is saying. So maybe that's what the rabbis are teaching us by including the book of Job in the canon. Be angry at God, questioning the conventional biblical theology it's not heretical, right? The book of Job says you can challenge the idea of God presented in the Bible and still be within the boundaries of the Bible. That's what Job brings to the table. It makes room for an idea that's antithetical to the Bible to actually be part of the Bible and accepts it. Freud, a nice Jewish boy, was not a big fan of religion, right? He said that people who believe in religion really haven't grown up. And according to Freud, a child needs a grown-up to be in charge, looking over them, and that religious adults think of God as a parent who needs to look to be in charge of us and keep us infantilized. But Freud was wrong, right? It's not that we have to mature out of religion. It's about religion maturing itself. And that's another lesson that we can learn from the book of Job. In Proverbs, in the 11th chapter of Proverbs, and also in chapter 23 of Job, Job's friends say that he must have sinned, and that's why he's suffering. But Job isn't blind to the reality, and he's saying something very important. His questioning of God is what God wants. We come close to God by saying the things that we feel, and we don't say the things that are untrue. We have to share our truth with God. That's how we can be close with God. Job is in the Bible to teach us that religion is about being allowed to express our intellectual integrity, right? Not to be intellectually untrue. Not that you walk into shul and you have to check your brain, right? Because it's only about things that don't feel right to us. Religion is not about quieting what we know deep inside of us is right. Religion is not about sacrificing our intellectual integrity. it's the beginning. In the beginning of Job, we're told that Job is Tom, right? He's perfect. But that meaning flips. Tom at the beginning of Job is the one who says that everything is perfect, right? The beginning, Job is Tom. He says, I accept whatever God gives me. I accept that. At the end of Job, Tom takes on a totally different idea. Tom is the perfect person, is the one who tells God the truth. When we can access all of our feelings and lay them out to God, that's what God wants. That's what makes our relationship with God real. And just being honest in any relationship is what makes it real. If you say that everything is perfect in a relationship, that's not a real relationship. And this is what the book of Job helps us, is also teaching us, that to say that everything is perfect, and even if I don't know what's going on, I still believe in the just God, and that makes it perfect. That's not what's, that's what Job is teaching us. Okay. Even in chapter 42, we just read that God says to Job's friends and to Eliphaz, who's the leader, he says, I'm angry with you because you didn't speak the truth. You didn't tell me the truth the way that Job does. In the beginning of the book, God is angry at Job for asking the questions. And at the end of the book, God is angry at Job's friends for not asking the questions, for not making it real. Job is the only one who speaks the truth. The book of Job teaches us that religion is not about being blind and just extolling God, right? It's seeing the world as it is and saying the truth about that world to God. It's interesting that liturgically, right, we never read the book of Job. There's no holiday where we read the book of Job. If you want to read Job, you have to make a conscious effort to do so. The only time we really study Job is really on Tisha B'Av. On Tisha B'Av, we're not supposed to study Torah because Torah is a joyous thing and we're not supposed to study Torah, but we're allowed to study the Echa, which is Lamentations. We're allowed to study the Midrashim on Echa. We're allowed to study Jeremiah and the laws of mourning and the laws of fasting. And we can also study the book of Job. That's the one day that we're supposed to study the book of Job, because Tisha B'Av is all about the idea of Hester Panim, about God removed God's self from our being able to see God. Not that God wasn't in charge of what was going on, but the idea is that God is removed and we don't feel God's presence. So when God's face is hidden, that's when we feel the suffering. And in the Torah, God is not hidden, right? God is very present. We have miracles like at Sinai, and we have miracles like the splitting of the Red Sea and the 10 plagues. And in the prophets, we don't have collective miracles, but we have individual revelation, that the prophets were able to have their own revelations, and they told us, were able to tell us what God was planning. And in the Ketuvim, in the wisdom literature, the books such as Psalms and Proverbs of Job and Ecclesiastes, there's no miracles and there's no prophecy. So the grand arc of Tanakh is the story of the disappearance, according to Job, is the disappearance of God. We feel God's presence much more in the Bible, less so in the prophets, and in the wisdom literature in Job, we don't feel God's presence at all. That's what the book of Job is telling us. And that's not saying that that's always the case, but according to Job, that's what we're seeing. But the Job is teaching us that when we're authentic and when we don't see God and when we acknowledge that, that's what's being real, right? Job is not understanding what happened to him. He's mad at God. He's expressing that, and that's what making his relationship with God real. At the end, God appears to Job in the whirlwind, and God appears in a whirlwind a number of times in the Bible, in Ezekiel and Amos and Habakkuk and Zechariah and Nehemiah and Jeremiah. And there are two important aspects of the speech that God is bringing us from the whirlwind. The first is that the divine voice doesn't answer Job's complaint directly, but just describes the wonders of the creation, right? Says, well, I don't have to explain it to you. You don't understand what's going on. That's what chapters 38 through 41 are all about. And the second is that actually Job does receive an answer. And the answer God says to him is, I'm in charge of the world. You can't always see how it works. You don't have the perspective and you don't have the wisdom. And when you don't have perspective and you don't have wisdom, that's where the belief comes in. So this sort of brings us full circle. I just wanted to read one more source and say a few more comments, and then I can listen to some of your comments. I see some of you have very strong comments or disagreeing, and that's okay. Can someone read this last source? Robert Alter, The Wisdom Books.
I'll read
Thank you.
if I can see.
Can you see it?
Many readers over the centuries have felt that God's speech to Job is not a real answer to the problem of undeserved suffering. And some have complained that it amounts to a kind of cosmic bullying of puny man by an overpowering deity. One must concede that it is not exactly an answer to the problem, because for those who believe that life should not be arbitrary, there can be no real answer concerning the good person who loses a child, not to speak of 10, or the blameless dear one who dies in an accident or is stricken with a terrible wasting disease. But God's thundering challenge to Job is not bullying, rather it rousingly introduces a comprehensive overview of the nature of reality that exposes the limits of Job's human perspective, anchored as it is in the restricted compass of human knowledge and the inevitable egoism of suffering.
Right. So we started out by asking what happens when our faith is tested. When things we expect or thought we were promised, like a good life, don't turn out the way they thought they would or they should. And the book of Job and the reward of living a good life is not a good life, but rather fellowship with God. God is powerful and God is not knowable to us as humans. But at the end of Job, there is a powerful connection between Job and God. Job actually hears and sees God for the first time. And there's a connection between Job, God, and all of humanity. So the ability to know that God is in the whirlwind, in the physical whirlwind of nature that comes to destroy things, and in the metaphysical whirlwind of our life, is to know that God is with us even when we suffer. And that calling out to God and challenging God and being angry with God when we can't understand why things happening, it's all part of being close to God. So my prayer for each of us is that we're able to carry Job's lessons and messages with us when we feel the burdens of life's unfairness. So I'm happy to entertain any thoughts, questions, rebuttals, rails. Barbara, yes, you've been waiting so patiently.
Yeah, thank you very much for this teaching. I didn't want to talk about the question of whether he got his just desserts, whether he understood anything. What I wanted to talk about is this idea that he was a good person. And it just says that he's a good person without sin over and over again. And we actually had a very interesting article came in the Hadar Pesach Reader that was written by Ethan Tucker. And it quotes a very interesting midrash from the Bavli in the Second Sota, in which the rabbis are trying to figure out who Job was, where he was historically, and they place him with Moses' father-in-law, Yitro, and Bilam, and Job are all at Pharaoh's court in Egypt while Pharaoh is trying to decide how to enslave the Israelites. And Bilam thinks it's a great idea, and we all know that Bilam does not fare too well. And Yitro can't stand the idea, so he runs away. But Job just goes along. So he doesn't do anything bad. He just goes along. And the rabbis in the Talmud apparently didn't like this. And so this is one of the reasons that the Talmud says that his silence is enough to justify the otherwise inscrutable suffering that Job must withstand in the book. So instead of righteous suffering, it's about a person who's a bystander, who he didn't sin, he didn't do anything wrong, but he didn't go out of his way to take any action. He did not protest. He was not an activist. So he was without sin. And I found the article is much more detailed. I found it's very compelling because it always bothered me. Noah was a righteous man. Job was a righteous, but what does that mean? He was without sin. I mean, it's a real cardboard kind of thing. And here in the Talmud, the rabbis say, yeah, he didn't do anything wrong, but he didn't go out of his way.
He didn't do anything right either.
He didn't go and try to make things right.
Right. In that instance, it says in the book of Job, it does talk about all the times, that he did try to,
He helped other people.
he did help other
suffer.
people. Right. And so,
Right.
so,
But that's not about injustice. I just read that yesterday because, as I told you, we're taking a
Right.
class about Job.
right.
And he helped individual people just as we would. If somebody has a problem, we help them.
Right.
But that isn't what the rabbis are saying. They were saying that he needed to be an activist at the time of when evil was being perpetuated, and he didn't do it.
He didn't do that. Right. That's the message of the prophets, that we have to be proactive, like I said, I like that idea of not looking up to God, but looking down to the people who are vulnerable in our society and taking care of them. And it's interesting that Job was there with Yitro, because Yitro was the one who created the whole court system, that told Moshe to create the whole court system. So that whole idea of justice was very much a part of Yitro's legacy. So it's interesting that he just walked away and he wasn't part of that, of trying
Yet he
to.
couldn't stand it, and he fled.
Right.
I really recommend this article, and if you get a hold, just write to
I
Hadar.
have the Pesach reader. I have the
Yes, but I recommend to anybody else, because you can get it. Just go to hadar.org, find their email address, and ask for it. It was Ethan Tucker's article about Job in their Pesach reader.
Thank you.
It's an excellent article.
Thank you for that. I just, I don't know, has anyone had any thoughts about the idea that, this whole, I thought that the way Micah presented it, the whole thing of Job never knows, and we never know why Job is suffering. But the whole idea of that God made this deal with the Satan at the beginning, I found that was I had never seen Job through that light before. This idea that, well, we do know exactly what, if you read the first 2 chapters and then the last chapter, you know exactly what happened. And I found that was very, very compelling. It's disturbing as well as compelling. I don't know. Any other questions? Yes, Susan.
I thought that part was interesting because God is presented as fairly prideful character, and Satan is challenging his pridefulness and trying to bring him down. But I guess in the end, Job comes through for him. But really, look what I have. I have this perfect man. He's got everything, and I've created him and it and the world. And I thought that was a strange take in that confrontation.
Right. And interesting that like I said, even in the Talmud, they said, that God gets into a deal with Satan. Like if it wasn't in the Torah, if it wasn't in the book of the Bible, we wouldn't even imagine such a thing. We wouldn't even allow ourselves to imagine such a thing. I know. So I find it I find it very challenging. These types of ideas, the idea that God, it could be cruel God, that God is a bully. And I've heard all of these things said about the book of Job. Personally, like I said, I find them hard. They resonate, and maybe that's exactly why I find them hard, because they do resonate. It does feel like God bullies Job at the end. In other words, when somebody says to me, "You can never understand," that doesn't leave any room for me in the relationship. That just, well, if I can't understand, you're right. I can't be in your head or in your skin. I'm not you. But that's sort of a conversation ender when somebody says you just don't, you can't understand. So it feels like it doesn't engender relationship. It feels like it pushes it away. Yeah, Sandy. Unmute yourself, please.
Sorry.
That's okay.
If you take the story of Job literally, it is really, really problematic, because not only is God anthropomorphized, he is also, as I guess it was Barbara that said, he's not a very attractive person. He's a petulant, petty, bullying, very vain and prideful person, which is not the God that I believe in at all. So I find if you take that story literally, it's very, very problematic. The only way, and also what you said about losing children, that always bothered me from when I was a kid, and I read that in Sunday school, that bothered me. What about those children? They didn't do anything wrong. So they're replaced by other children. Are children possessions? And I found that extremely troubling.
Right, especially at the end when they say, well, he got everything back. It's like he didn't get everything back. You can get more sheep and oxen, but what, you can have 20 more children. That doesn't change the ones that were gone.
I felt that way when we learned about this in Sunday school when I was a child. I found it very, very troubling. But the only way you can deal with it is to take it completely metaphorically, that this is a way of addressing the problem of evil in the world. Because if there's evil in the world and God is good, that means that God isn't all powerful. And if there's evil in the world and God is all powerful, that means that God isn't good. So it's very, very troubling.
Right.
But so it's just a way of addressing the problem of evil in the world. And the way I look at it is what you mentioned earlier about the operating room. I recall something where everybody was blindfolded or blind, and they all touched a different part of an elephant.
Mm-hmm.
And they all had a different, depending on the part of the elephant that they touched, they all had a different view of what this creature it was that they were touching. So we can't see, and that's partially explained at the end, we can't see the whole picture. We have no way of knowing the whole picture, and we have no way of knowing why there is evil in the world, and why more than that, why there is suffering in the world. And so that's my only way of dealing with this story. But just take it completely as a metaphor. And I certainly don't take that as a view of the nature of God, as I said before.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate your perspective. I think it's less about, it's classically the book about theodicy, about, good and evil, but I think it's really, to talk about perspective, I think you take a step back, it's really about belief, because the good and the evil that exists, you can try to explain it, you cannot try to explain it successfully, unsuccessfully. The bottom line is it's a test of faith, because there is going to be evil. How you explain the evil, there's different ways to get around that, but the bottom line is it exists. So if you want to believe in God, a God who's loving and just and kind and good, and that there's this evil, it really is a matter of faith. So it really it goes to our core faith and our belief. So that's I think that's the challenge of Job, is the faith. That was Job's literal challenge, and that's our challenge. How do we reconcile things that are very hard for us? And I think being able to talk about them, deal with them, and like we read at the beginning, being able to rile at God. The people in the camps who were able to despise God and hate God and curse God, but they were still believing in God nonetheless. That's the crux of the Job lesson, I believe.
Oh, could I just say something? The people in Israel, there are many people in Israel now who are suffering a crisis of faith because of what happened. Here, these people were worshiping, and it's almost like they were punished for being there and worshiping. So I think what happened is it's really horrible, and it's a kind of I understand a lot of people that were in that situation are now experiencing a crisis of faith, and certainly understandably. There are terrible things that happen.
Right. To Tree of Life, yes. Were you raising your hand, Barbara? Or yes, go ahead.
I just on that point, because again, that's something we discussed yesterday. Yes, there and there are just mistakes that people make. and that lead to bad consequences. And our professor yesterday was talking about, he's in Israel, was talking about systemically how the authorities in Israel over many years have noted how dangerous that situation was, but because of fear of the political reprisals from the ultra-Orthodox, did not take the necessary steps. So you can't bring God into that.
Right.
It was a terrible tragedy, but it was human error, human mistakes. I don't want to say evil, but bad judgment. And I would say, I'm sorry if people are losing their faith over it, but this is not God. God didn't have anything to do with that.
I agree with you, Barbara. It was a
It
real
was-
travesty in terms
So
of.
do I. I agree.
Yeah, this is,
Great.
as I said, we are studying, Irene and I are studying the book of Job, and our professor just wrote a new translation of it. And he lives in Israel, and I'm just repeating what he said yesterday.
Right. There's a great article about that in the Times of Israel about that. About that. This has been this was a disaster in the making. This was a disaster in the making.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a very nice explanation as far as I'm concerned. Probably the best explanation that there could be. So I appreciate your bringing that up.
Thank you.
So, okay, so thank you so much for joining us. Next week, Book of Ruth, which is right before we have Shavuot, and that will be the final in our series. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your thoughts and your contributions. And
Thanks, Rabbi.
stay well.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Koa.
Thank you, Rabbi Perlman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.